On the way to Midway Airport from Duluth. Son of a bitch, can this goddamn cab driver get out of the way? Shit, and this is a goddamn Prius? Fucking idiots. Son of a bitch. Can't you goddamn drive? I'm late and I gotta catch my goddamn plane. Midway isn't that big and it's not that far from downtown Chicago, but still. Got caught by my goddamn chatty boss as I was leaving. Again. I have to catch a goddamn plane to submit our proposal for consideration. It'll be a goddamn bonus if we get this goddamn contract. Bitch. My summoned Uber finally stops in front of the parking lot and transit station. The lines of cars to leave and arrive stretched for several blocks. It's like this every weekday, every time I leave Midway. I hate leaving at rush hour. I tossed a 20 to the driver for a second tip as he pulled my bag out of the trunk. Now have to join the lemmings and run to the TSA pre-check line. Dodging people on the crosswalk on the Cicero Avenue Bridge is always fun. Assholes walk like they're at Costco and leave their cart in the middle of the goddamn aisle, so no one can get around them. It's always a shock to them when a sharp, "move it," shakes their world. Don't you bastards know that slower traffic keeps to the right? Stay the screw out of my way. At the end, I suddenly see a low, bearded, thick-assed bicyclist standing there, holding a sign with my name on it that reads 1913 P. Morgan. That's the year that the get-rich Baron J.P. Morgan died almost 110 years ago. That is the password I use for my 2 investment accounts. I stopped in front of the courier and looked at him intently. He looked at the picture of me he held in his hand, then smiled. In a menacing voice smelling of old whiskey and cigarettes, he croaked, "Ron Westerfield, a package for you." His grease-stained fingers handed me a bubble-wrapped tablet. As soon as it was in my hands, he ran down the sidewalk with the crowd toward the parking garages. Within seconds, he turned the corner and disappeared. What the hell was going on? I looked down. It was my goddamn clipboard, my scratches and dirt and pen marks. I felt the spot where I'd poked the back panel. It was mine. I entered the password, and a text file opened. "Hello, Mr. Westerfield. Before you proceed, you should know that this file will completely disappear in less than 90 seconds. Try to take a picture of it and it will disappear immediately. You have no technical skills, so don't try." Damn asshole got it right. Did you like the sign that caught your eye? Yes, I have your passwords and I've already changed most of them, as well as your questions and answers to them and notifications of backup mailboxes. I have taken control of your accounts. Email, Roth, IRA, SEP IRA, 401k, and your taxable brokerage financial accounts. I haven't forgotten about your numerous bank accounts either. I even changed your Netflix account for your amusement. You won't be able to access any account quickly. Don't think about changing your passwords in the next couple hours. By the way, your cell phone is also locked. I disconnected your cell service a few hours ago to make sure it's now down. You've been so busy today that you may not have noticed the lack of calls. Now I have your undivided attention? Damn right you do, you bastard, whoever you are. Amazingly, you've accumulated $503,543.21 in tax-deferred accounts and another $301,659.76 in taxable accounts. All of this wealth you accumulated by the time you were 37 years old. Unfortunately, it was gained at the expense of many people. These are the people you trampled, crushed, fired, belittled, stole from, abused, and some were sexually assaulted. Don't get me wrong, you destroyed a couple people who were just like you. I had no objection to you massacring these vermin. I know you like the word vermin. That's what you thought everyone who stood in your way was. How did that bastard figure it out? Now, let me get back to your case. I'm sure you're worried about what I might demand of you. In fact, all of this was done to give you a choice. You now have less than a minute to make that choice. You are a disgusting person with no morals. Even you can't disagree with that. Your 3 previous jobs ended up restructuring through bankruptcy, resulting in huge layoffs. Don't even try to say that's not to your credit. You were able to quietly torpedo several plans that could have saved each of those companies and their employees. And that's not to mention your active attempts at sabotage. In addition, you leaked information to the takeover firm that made sure your employers failed. This made you and the takeover firm a very nice profit. The 3 companies that went bankrupt brought these vultures a profit of several tens of millions. These profits were both higher and lower. The SEC might be interested in this information, not to mention the prosecutor. You and I both know the IRS pays whistleblowers. Do I still have your attention? Damn right you do, you bastard. These actions have made you a lot of enemies. Powerful financial, legal, and some powerful purely physical enemies. Another habit of yours is to harass women who have partners. Some of them were married, some were just in relationships. All of them were in dire financial straits. You had to be able to sense their weakness. You called them monkeys because they held onto their jobs with their tails. Because of this, you had even more faceless, powerful enemies. These are enemies who have nothing to lose. So now you have a choice. You can return to your home immediately, step down, and leave the Midwest. Make sure you are at least 1,200 miles away, so New York and New England or even Atlanta or Dallas won't do. I actually suggest you go overseas. If you go, nothing else will happen except what I have already done. 2 days ago, I withdrew all but $100 from each of your tax-sheltered IRA, SEP IRA, and 401ks and transferred it to one of your bank accounts. You'll have to pay the IRS a 10% early withdrawal fee, and your current marginal federal tax rate is about 37%. You're smart enough to realize that the reduction in staffing should be a little less than 5%. That means that from $500,000, you'll get about $250,000 after state and federal taxes and penalties. Not a bad haircut for you, all things considered. I also cashed out many of your taxable accounts. You will have to pay those earnings as ordinary income since they were cashed out in less than a year. What's another $54,000 between friends? If you decide to continue and don't quit immediately, very bad things will happen to you. You won't be able to recover from them. It's your choice. Oh yeah, have a good day. Goddamn asshole. Suddenly the screen went black and my tablet rebooted. Goddamn asshole, I now have over $300,000. This day doesn't get any better. If I make one last presentation in Seattle today, and we get the contract, I'll have over $120,000, including bonuses and kickbacks from proposed vendors. I will only have 24 hours to get back to my apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast as early as tomorrow, Friday afternoon. Then, I'll start packing to head to Mexico and beyond. I may take the weekend to finalize things and get away. Screw it. I know this contract is done with. Even if whoever's after me gets the DA involved, I'll have time to run away and take a new name. Martin, my contact at the firm where I work, offered me the opportunity if the case goes through. I still have over $800,000 in cash stashed away from him alone, not to mention my hidden accounts overseas. He must have made 20 times that much on my information. The cash could make me disappear and become someone else. Screw it, I'm out of here. Picking up my suitcase with tablet in hand, I head for the TSA pre-check line. I only have 15 minutes to catch my flight, and there are only 5 people ahead of me. First damn thing that goes right today. I drop my suitcase and tablet on the conveyor belt and wait to be motioned to enter. Suddenly, everything comes to a standstill. A few people look at me and a few more approach. Sir, I'd like you to keep your hands in front of you and not make any quick movements. What the hell are you doing? Sir, stay calm and don't make any movements. I was handcuffed and immediately dragged away from the TSA pre-check line. Somehow, I looked up at the baggage scan screen and saw it. It showed a gun and a cell phone with wires connected to a small cube in my suitcase. An interrogation ensued, but I kept quiet and thanked God for Miranda. It took 2 hours before I had the help of a good lawyer. The immediate charges included the transportation of 3D printing, ammunition, $500,000 US dollars, 40,000 euros, 110,000 British pounds, and 150,000 Mexican pesos. The pesos were worth about 75,000 US dollars. I counted the rest as little more than equal to a US dollar. They were all in medium-sized bills. There was also a half kilo of my own cocaine, wrapped in an aluminum foil box. The wires were connected to a phone. It looked like a detonator. I was taken into custody without bail as a flight risk. They took my passport, too. Somehow, I had a ticket booked from Seattle to Mexico City for tomorrow. And I had a flight booked for Friday night to somewhere in Africa I had never heard of. 2 days later, my firm filed charges about the $31,000 I allegedly tried to embezzle from their accounts. That said goodbye to any possibility of help from their pit bull lawyers. I'm totally screwed. That Friday night, old Mr. Harrison, Ron Westerfield's former roommate, was sitting at a nearby bar ordering a craft beer. No longer wearing my disguise, I smiled, then smoothed my skirt while sipping my short beer. What kind of crap are you serving me? You know I hate light IPAs. I looked directly at my bartender. Mark, don't make me get up. You think you're funny? The jerk smiled and laughed. Liz, you've been distracted for weeks now. I've decided to get you back. He chuckled and placed my usual stout in front of me. This time, it was full-sized. It's on the house. I'll leave you for a bit and get back to you later. He chuckled and smiled warmly, moving on to the new customers. Yes, I've been distracted. Been distracted for quite some time now. I watched as he moved on to serve the third visitor. My thoughts returned to the events of 2 years ago. When the door opened, I said, Hi, Aunt Sophie. How's Uncle Ben doing? Thank you for coming. The hospice nurse told me he's really running out of time. The painkillers are helping him with minimal pain, but it is shortening his life and his waking hours. We both agree on that. She gave me a resigned but not sad smile. She was resigned to his rapid fading, and he was resigned to it. What did he say when he was informed that he was unable to work? We all go someday. Better to be with Sophia now than in a car accident. Look after her, okay? Make sure she's always by your side. Okay? It's been a long road for all of us. We called you here because Beniamino and I wanted to talk to you about something. Hear us out, and you can make whatever decision you want, and we won't mind. She led me over to the bed in the living room of the apartment. It was the only room that could accommodate a hospital bed and all the associated medical equipment. Uncle Ben looked at me and smiled. He had always been my favorite uncle. He was also my only uncle, sort of. My late mom was an only child. But as it happens in immigrant families, friends can become closer than blood relatives. She and my mom, the firstborn Americans, grew up together in the same house as brother and sister, and that bond never weakened. He helped me bury her when cancer struck her. Dad had died of a heart attack a few years before, and Uncle Ben was with us as well. Dad was a typical Pollock, strong as an ox as he worked in a craft shop, drank moderately, smoked a lot, and stayed away from doctors. He wouldn't have fit in with the anti-vaxxers, but really he just didn't like doctors. He was fine with science, for someone else. He was fine with just being himself. At least he died quickly while working. Thank goodness the insurance benefits from the union kept us going until we got back on our feet. Dad never believed in saving much because he never had extra money. I heard Elizabeth, and Uncle Ben immediately gasped. It was frustrating for him to be so limited, but he smiled again and waved at me. My aunt made a motion so that my ear was right next to his mouth. Thank you for coming, he whispered. I sat in silence while he rested and recovered for a few minutes. Then, for 20 minutes, he and my aunt told me the story of the business they both worked for as it quickly went bankrupt and was bought out and liquidated. Over 400 people lost their jobs. Most of them were elderly or low income. Most of them had to settle for more difficult jobs with lower pay and few benefits. I had heard this story before and knew he had to tell it to me again. I listened to both of them with pleasure. Elisabetta, we would suddenly have a shortage of something. I would look for a new supplier of the same or better quality that was sometimes cheaper or at the same price. Purchase orders were held up in the office until we needed it or we had to stop production. After the 5th time, I found them lying on Westerfield's desk or thrown in the trash. Most of the workers saw what he was doing. Even the contracted building custodians helped us fish the POs out of the trash. After that, Westerfield bought a shredder. It was a belt shredder, and a couple times we even put the pages back together. By then, our company was starting to lose contracts. That's when your Aunt Sophia noticed something was wrong with me. He closed his eyes to rest. I held his hand, and Aunt Sophia put her arm around my shoulders. He was diagnosed with stage 4 inoperable pancreatic cancer. They were both out of work, and the medical costs of the COBRA program were higher than unemployment benefits. They were devastated and began draining all of their savings. I remember putting them in touch with a social worker who found programs that allowed them to stop bleeding. The hospice social worker helped them walk their final journey together. Now she was facing a very financially difficult old age. She would never be luxurious anyway. For the working class, luxury means a roof over your head, enough food, medical care, a safe enough neighborhood, and enough money to go out to dinner once a month. Now, for her, however, it's much closer to her heart. The guys at the top get a haircut and the ones at the bottom get their legs cut off. Those at the top are listened to. The people at the bottom are coddled and feel they should be grateful for any crumbs they get. The more money you have, the more equal you are. After resting a bit, Uncle Ben opened his eyes. Blinking, he saw me and smiled again. He whispered, "Elisabetta, isn't there any way you could nail him down? Can we make Westerfield pay for what he did?" I immediately thought of the movie The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. They played Hooker and Henry Gondorff, a pair of 1920s crooks. Gangster Lonigan murdered Redford's pal Luther. As an aspiring professional actress who loved this movie, I knew the lines by heart. Hooker, "Listen, Gondorff, am I going to find out what the big con is or not?" Henry, "What's your hurry?" Hooker, "I want to play at Lonigan's." Henry, "Do you know anything about that guy?" Hooker, "Yeah, he killed Luther. Anything else I should know?" After he calms down. "Okay, he's in the numbers business on the South Side. He owns a packing house, several banks. Yeah, and half the politicians in New York and Chicago. No fix in this world will cool him off if he blows on you." Hooker, "I'm going to get him anyway. Why? Because I don't know enough about murder to kill him. Thanks, Wiki. Please support them." I waited a few minutes to think. Addressing them by name, I replied, "Zio Beniamino and Zia Sophia. They have a lot of money and we don't. Revenge should only be if I can do it safely." My aunt and uncle nodded in agreement. All three of us knew one thing. Going up against Westerfield and his cronies would not be easy, and probably useless. We talked about how this group had no morals, few restrictions, and lots of money. That's where the bite came in handy. Everything for revenge had to be done without a trace. None of us knew what would happen if I or my aunt were recognized. 2 weeks later, Uncle Ben passed away quietly and peacefully. Aunt Sophie and I sat by his side. We sang selections from Italian opera, peasant songs his parents had sung to him as a child, and religious songs he loved. This first-generation Italian could not become a second-generation Italian, although he and my aunt loved me as one. I was blessed because of them. In the weeks that followed, I began to spend my free hours from my waitressing job and, more important, acting auditions researching Ronald George Thomas Westerfield. I began gathering information on Westerfield and his known associates. Public information was no good for this, except for addresses, property tax data, and the usual self-promotion on social media. These investigations showed only hints of what lurked beneath the surface. Being a fan of crime mysteries, I had watched shows like CSI many times, which got me thinking about searching deeper online and infiltrating specialized sites. I didn't know much except one thing. I knew I was probably playing with unstable nitroglycerin on a rocking boat during a thunderstorm, holding an iron flagpole, and being shit-faced drunk. Had I missed something? The clinking of glasses brought me back to the bar. I sipped my stout and looked at my bartender, Mark. He'd known me since I'd moved into the neighborhood over 3 years ago. At first, I moved in with a few people in the same rented house. It was very difficult for the guys to learn how to keep the kitchen clean until the day came, when food poisoning hit all the guys at the same time. I will never forget how the guys had diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea for 18 hours straight before they became weak. We had one bathroom, so I spent the next 3 days at my uncle and aunt's apartment on the couch. The guys had to do a complete cleaning and sanitizing of the entire house, and posted food safety rules in the kitchen. I think once was enough to wean them off their bad habits. After the lease ended, we scattered to the wind, but remained friends. The best part about their food poisoning was that they started listening to me more. I used to work in commercial kitchens and knew the ins and outs of safe food management. They were studying computer science and I was studying theater. We existed in different worlds. It wasn't until a couple of months into my tenancy that I realized I now needed their knowledge. I felt like Donald Rumsfeld. There are things we know about. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is, we know that there are things we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. Those words always gave me a headache. It was true, but it still gave me a headache. I guess that meant that this theater girl knew she didn't know shit about computers, the internet, or stalking anyone. Now my job was not to look like I was pruning them, but only interested in learning more about computers and the internet than my current just click here or do not click there. I got invitations to their hangouts and started socializing with the computer geek crowd. They were actually great people. They were a bit nerdy at times, but they actually knew about a lot of things I hadn't paid attention to. It took a few parties with them and a lot of internet searches to learn what I needed to know about. Unknown geeks. I began to understand the geek language pretty well. However, as with any foreign language, speaking it is more difficult than understanding it. If I heard the humorous joke, loud groaning is allowed here. No, loud groaning is a must here. You have to pay your syntax again. I was going to have my own version of 18 hours of shit and vomit. This was my payment for getting an unofficial degree in internet security and computer science. From those conversations at parties, my friends immediately and directly pointed out that everyone leaves little snippets of traceable fingerprints when they're online. Then I learned that hardware has signatures too. I also learned that there are ways to minimize my risk. At flea markets and swap meets, I started buying various computer hardware components, as well as software and operating system programs. Obsolete operating system credentials were especially cheap. I always disguised myself and paid cash in well-used bills. Working as a waitress helped get used bills. The disguise and acting made the game somewhat enjoyable. For starters, I was able to practice being old, young, male, female, white, Hispanic, Eastern European, Western European, Native, and other foreigner. Through my theater classes and my experiences, I practiced being thin, naturally from nature, full-bodied, stocky, heavy, or very fat SSBBW, and being able to add or subtract a couple of inches of height. Brown-tinted contacts helped me, as I am blue-eyed. Blue eyes just didn't work when I disguised myself as Hispanic, Southern European, or Middle Eastern. I experimented with different accents. I was Irish, Scottish, from the Deep South, East Texas, New York, Canadian from Newfoundland, and French Canadian. I was a native of the western plains of Kansas, a Yooper from Upper Michigan, Southern New Mexico, and of course, Southern and Northern California. When out on the street, I sometimes impersonated a Lithuanian grandmother, a German housewife from Hamburg, a Sicilian priest, a French cook from Provence, a Bosnian courier, and even a Slovakian fashion designer. I have not tasted Cajun, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, or Vietnamese cuisine. I picked up on the differences between different regions of Mexico, Central, and South America. My high school Spanish was just a starting point, and I only chose 3 different regions and social classes for my Spanish accent. It was a game for me, an important practice for my acting, closet, and makeup skills. Buying a couple of used fat suits at the theaters and most of my clothes at Goodwill helped keep costs down. I spent a lot of time keeping track of my booty electronically. I needed to know my enemy, the companies he worked for, and the people he socialized with. I needed to see his tribe to try to find weaknesses to exploit. I needed to know how he operated, who he was meeting and where he was meeting. Who was he socializing with and where? Who was he doing this with? To keep myself safe, every couple weeks I physically donated inexpensive computer components. Parts cost $75 a crack, and that was already a lot since acting jobs were not steady and well-paying at this early stage of my career. I hoped that all I was doing was making it harder to keep track of any of my actions. The phrase, "don't commit a crime if you can't do time," kept me up at night. My other anxiety companion was, are you really paranoid if they're really out to get everyone? Thanks to Joseph Heller for this paraphrased phrase from Catch-22. Another thing I quickly realized is that the strongest link in the chain is the weakest link. I decided from the beginning not to involve anyone but my aunt. Only when absolutely necessary could the auntie be involved. Internet connections could be traced, so I started using public Wi-Fi accounts at various coffee shops, hotels, libraries, schools, and even a few McDonald's. I had to be careful with internet hotspots. Being surrounded by college students helped me hide from prying eyes. Students tend to be careless with internet connections, usernames and passwords, and even lend computers or access to private and public servers. Visually and electronically, I was rarely the same person in any given location. Motel parking lots were also a great place because passwords there tended to be standard, and hiding across the street or having coffee while waiting for someone made me invisible. I laughed when I found out how easy it was to send fake emails from a Linux server. For years, I had been blocking spam senders, and now I realized that all of this was ineffective, if not impossible. The senders listed were not real. Just for fun, I sent myself an email from Ronald at jackass_and_asshole.com to one of my useless mailboxes. It showed up in my inbox immediately, bypassing some spam blockers. I was also able to buy time anonymously on several different VPNs and a few offshore VPN accounts. I was hoping that using these VPNs would make it harder to track my electronic footprints. Surely the CIA and FBI would have been able to figure me out quickly. I had no intention of selling corporate or government secrets, killing, buying stolen goods, hacking elections, selling or buying drugs or weapons. I believed I was in a semi-safe position. It was a game I wanted to win, but didn't want to sacrifice myself trying to do so. It took me over a year to get a decent idea of Westerfield and his cronies. I got to see him in person at some of his dinner meetings, where he tried to wine and dine new prospects for business or for his bed. As I found out, thanks to the rampant COVID, I was able to get a job by getting cash under the table at the two restaurants Westerfield frequented. There was no paperwork by which I could be traced, especially when I wore different masks and COVID masks at each restaurant. By taking tables next to his tables, I was able to photograph some of his fellow diners and overhear some of their conversations. It was then that I began to piece together his evil bondage. If you're from Chicago and were aware of city politics in the 70s, you may have heard this phrase from one of the previous mayors. Don't worry, she later joined the conspiracy because she needed their power to get anything accomplished. Westerfield and his co-conspirators did not speak quietly. I took a battery-powered wireless microphone that I hid in the centerpiece of my desk. It transmitted a signal to my laptop, hidden in the break room for recording. Some of the other conversations of other regulars caught on tape were, how shall I put it, very interesting. I learned of several affairs, not to mention drug deals and uncontrolled gambling. What I liked the most were the couples who try to keep their relationships intact. There are good people in the world, and those good people help me keep my sanity and humanity. One of the things I did, but didn't know why at the time, was bring home samples of the glasses he and his co-conspirators used for fingerprints and possible DNA analysis. Better to have more options in case I need them in the future. By this point, Westerfield was on his fourth company. The previous three, one of which was owned by my uncle, had been bought out due to failed reorganizations. His current company was not a candidate for this form of liquidation. He seemed to have moved up the food chain of responsibility to bring in real business. Listening to him talk, he was once again coordinating with his suppliers for kickbacks. So Liz, how about a penny for your thoughts? Breaking into my thoughts, Mark smiled at me. Where had he come from? Looking at him, I had never noticed the glint in his eyes toward me, or even that smile. Why hadn't I noticed it before? I know I've been very busy the past 2 years, but to miss something so important. Mark? I raised my empty glass. Make it a short stout. I need to go home, and I'll be at my limit. I lived within walking distance of the bar, and without an available walking companion, I knew I wouldn't be safe afterward. I'd been very stressed and busy the last couple weeks, and tonight I needed to unwind, not get drunk. He brought me a short stout and stayed with me. The bar became quiet, the regulars slowly leaving. It was officially closing in an hour. So what have you been up to for the last month? You look like you've been through the war. That meant something since he was in the army and had been on a hot tour of duty in Iraq. Sometimes I'd see the scar on his forearm, and he always changed the subject if anyone asked about it. Oh, just taking care of some business. Just wrapping things up and kind of celebrating. Can't celebrate any more than I am right now. I shook my head. Otherwise, I'll never get home. What about you? What do you do? Jenny and I broke up 2 months ago. Unofficially, she couldn't handle bartending and stakeout. Officially, we just didn't work out. I decided it would be best to be open about how we felt about the way we were together. We just weren't good together anymore. She picked up on that idea and added her side of the story. I'm fine, she is too. She's not a bad person. It was nice to end things on a frank note. Sorry to hear you two broke up. I know it's never easy. You two seemed happy together. Congratulations on being frank and honest. It shows what kind of person you are. At that moment, something clicked in my jammed head. But what did you say about the ambush? A sheepish expression appeared on Mark's face. He moved closer and spoke in a low voice. Er, he exhaled, looking us over. Please keep this a secret. Sometimes I'm hired by an honest attorney to keep an eye on certain people. They are usually spouses coming out of marriages and sometimes corporations. I do this as it pays well, and she knows me well enough not to get her or me in trouble. Suddenly, half a dozen couples entered the room and started ordering a portion each. There were 4 fancy drinks with ice cream, and I realized our conversation wasn't going to continue today. He immediately headed over to the couples and got to work. I sipped my stout and thought about the last 2 months. I quickly finished the rest of my drink and waved goodbye to Mark. My body was calling for a warm bath and a long-awaited nap. Sunlight was streaming in through the window. It seemed strange to me, and I stayed lying in bed pondering. That's when I realized it was the midday sun from the window. Checked my alarm clock. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. Aren't Saturdays beautiful? Eager to continue the celebration, I made myself French toast with stale Italian bread. Restaurant trips for stout were strictly limited to twice a month. A fancy breakfast at home was part of the monthly budget and was a rare slice of heaven on earth. Aunt Sophie and I were going to have dinner together tonight. She needed to celebrate too, and I was going to treat myself to another long hot bath after dinner, reading one of my smutty novels. I hadn't been able to do that very often over the past year. In the last 9 months, I hadn't gotten any closer to my goal of getting revenge when the breakdown occurred. One of my many targets was the condominium building where Westerfield lived. I always thought that if I could somehow manage to break into his apartment, I could learn a lot. I could also get him into some serious trouble. I looked into all sorts of ways to get into that building. Being a maintenance man, being hired as a maid, being a painter or repairman, and more. However, nothing safe could be found. The condominium management was closing these vacancies to insured and bonding companies who screened their employees for insurance and contractual requirements. I even tried to get hired by the fire department and the trash removal company. Before that, I had taken several courses for my CDL license, and it would take me 3 months to finish them. But it was an investment I didn't want to make yet. I also didn't want to risk my personal information being used. I thought about showing up at the apartment as a furniture mover. I was actually at a last-hour sale and purchased some not-so-great antique furniture for $100. The estate sale company knew it would cost them more to haul it all out, and I walked away with $100 of their removal money. I was able to quickly rent a large van and move the furniture into a small storage unit. To save space and make the job easier, the hopeless items were immediately turned into firewood. These pieces of wood, a few at a time, were put into different dumpsters. My experience on the set has given me enough skill to improve the furniture enough to make it look good, should I need to go that route. Another option I considered was buying an apartment in his building, starting at $1.2 million, or renting an apartment for a year for $72,000 to $90,000. The building only allowed 10% rentals, and you could only rent an apartment for 1 year out of 5. I didn't have $72,000 or the credit to get a loan of that size to buy an apartment. I kept digging. Going to the condo's internal owners-only website, I found that the condo next to Westerfield's was now open for short-term rentals for 6 months. The owner had died, and the responsibility was suddenly assigned to his son who had gone overseas. The condominium management allowed him to rent the unit for 6 months to pay most of the dues and late fees. The rent was to be $36,000. The time was approaching 5 o'clock in the evening when I had to leave to have dinner at my aunt's condo. I got dressed and took the bus to Aunt Sophie's. I was lucky that I only had to wait 2 minutes for the bus. The trip only took 15 minutes and then another 2 minutes of walking. As I opened the door to her apartment with my key, I smelled the smell of peasant food from the days of her youth. Food that had become prized and was now worth much more. As Uncle Ben used to say, "The damn yuppies have made everything good and cheap expensive." Aunt Sophie saw me come in and immediately offered me something on a spoon to try from the pot on the stove. "Elisabetta, what do you think?" she asked with a smile. I had never tasted bad food at her place. I had also never even had a good meal at her place. All the meals were very good, great, or just extraordinary. And after all, I had to eat ramen for months when finances were tight. I set the table, brought out a plate of antipasto, and opened the wine. 10 minutes later, she sat down at the table and we began our meal. We ate one small, by American standards, meal at a time. The first was paper-thin prosciutto di Parma, olives, fried polenta squares, and pickled vegetables. I raised my glass to toast, to Aunt Sophie's success. But instead of raising her glass and mine, she stood up and said, Elisabetta, to all your hard work, dedication, perseverance, and persistence. None of this would have happened if it weren't for you, my dear. She then clinked her glass against mine. I stood up and looked her in the eye. And if it wasn't for you risking your meager savings, none of this would have happened either. We drank, then hugged, then toasted to Uncle Ben, then proceeded to the antipasto. We slowly finished the 3 courses while listening to Vivaldi's Seasons. Now that it was the turn of the last course, we sampled the cheeses and fruit. Then we retired to the living room sipping digestives. For me, digestives are an acquired taste, like learning to like radicchio, a bitter lettuce. You have to learn to appreciate things that have bitterness. It makes the sweet that much sweeter. Life comes in bitter and sweet, too. Aunt Sophie, I still can't get over the fact that you sold Uncle Ben's car to pay 6 months' rent. I know the car meant a lot to you and it was a lot of money. Elisabetta, I didn't drive it very often. It was more expensive to insure and license it. Plus, I had to borrow another $5,000 to cover the condominium rent. You've learned so much about Westerfield. I knew you'd get it, and this was the only way to do it. She sipped her bitter and carbonated water and looked out the window. Besides, Beniamino saved up and paid cash for that SUV 10 months before he died. With the current shortage of cars, I got as much for it as he paid, especially with the low mileage. No, it was the right choice. Uber and the bus are perfectly fine with me. I remember telling you it was more money than you could afford. If it didn't work out, I would have paid you back sooner or later. It was an unsustainable investment for you. And I remember telling you that it could end in nothing. But what is life but a gamble? It was the only way to get physically close to it. I had $45,000 in a safety deposit box. Remember I told you, let's do it, and don't argue with me, Elisabetta. Then we visited Joan, and you sent the proposal. That was in the afternoon. Joan Simmons, a well-known local real estate agent, had electronically submitted to her son an offer for a cash lease for her client with the name of a condominium management firm. The offer included paying rent directly to the condominium management company to cover late fees. The son must have been in touch as he responded yes within an hour. Payments were due the next business day. Joan's husband was in hospice and my aunt was a volunteer for hospice families. Aunt Sophie knew from talking to the social worker that Joan was depressed about her husband's deteriorating condition and her own serious health problems. Soon, Joan would become a candidate for hospice care herself. Her business had already been running on autopilot for months. During our visit with Joan, Aunt Sophia let me into Joan's home office and onto her unsecured computer. An offer was sent to her son, who lives overseas, for a full lease for $36,000. The offer was quickly accepted. The next morning, the money from the safety deposit box was quickly transferred to Joan's corporate account by an elderly man with a severe limp. He asked only for a receipt. A few hours later at Joan's house, I transferred $36,000 to the condominium management company electronically. The condominium debt was almost paid off. The management company and the son never brought it up again. Aunt Sophia, CarMax quickly bought back the SUV, and most of the cash in your safety deposit box would be returned. You were only $5,000 short at that point. After refueling Campari with acqua frizzante, a slightly bitter Italian liqueur mixed with sparkling water, we rested from our meal. A few minutes later, we were brought biscotti to be dipped in decaf espresso. Aunt Sophia? I pulled a package out of my coat. This is for you. Her eyes widened at the sight of the wad of bills in the envelope. It's yours. She couldn't believe the amount of money she held in her hands. You can't put them in the bank, but in a safety deposit box you can. You can only spend it a little at a time. Remember that with money you have to remain invisible. She was holding $150,000 in medium-sized bills. It was her portion of Westerfield's pirate booty. Stealing from a pirate should have been a concept for discussion at parties with philosophy, law, psychology, and religion students. I don't really have a dogmatic answer to this question. I simply cared about my aunt and uncle and the harm that had been done to them. She didn't know that I was keeping more for her in case she ever needed it. For myself, I kept nothing. All my expenses were covered by part-time jobs. I smiled at her like the Cheshire Cat. Auntie had the good sense not to ask me questions about how I got them. I remember that as soon as we signed the lease on the apartment, I had to decide what to do. As a tenant, I had to look real and be traceable in some way. I figured I had a week to get it right. As a cover story, I made up that I had moved from St. Petersburg, Florida, to be near my unnamed niece. After the first week of moving, I had a few cute-looking antiques, if you don't look closely, of old living room furniture from a storage unit. I spent a few days in the storage unit cleaning them out. The storage unit was about 35 miles from home. Stopped early Sunday morning at a Home Depot store near a workers' community, 3 young men were hired for money by a short, elderly Mexican woman. They were to load a truck that day and then unload and arrange the furniture in an apartment on the Gold Coast. The truck was borrowed from a church parking lot, and the license plates were swapped for the day with a similarly parked truck across town. I later returned the truck with regular license plates and a full tank of gas. The cab inside was scrubbed to a shine. It was the day of a Chicago Bears home game, and no one was out on the road during the game. It didn't make sense for regular people to stand in traffic on the Gold Coast before or after the game on the day of a Bears home game. I moved furniture during the game. My bedroom in the rented apartment only had an air mattress on the floor and a few folding tables and chairs. These tables were for a few computers in various states of assembly, another for my makeup, and the largest was for my desk where I researched and mapped Westerfield and his buddies. There was also a clothes rack and shelves that held my wigs and disguises. The door to the kitchen was always closed. Anyone peeking out the front door of the condominium saw only a furnished living room. I ordered groceries suitable for an elderly person online to be delivered for the first few weeks from a local non-network grocery store. Because of the personalized approach, old Mr. Harrison paid cash. Under the terms of the lease, all utilities were paid by the owner. Water, cable, and internet were the responsibility of the condominium association. After moving in, it took a week for old Mr. Harrison to settle in. He soon became known as the quiet old guy with the walker who rarely left his house. He became famous and then became invisible, as most old people do. My next task was to find a way into Westerfield's apartment or find a way to get the sensor through the walls. The second week, old Mr. Harrison saw Westerfield's weekly maid, Lulu, and struck up a brief conversation with her. The next week I became Kara, an elderly Irish woman working as a contracted helper for old Mr. Harrison. To Lula, I was just another woman earning barely enough to cover living expenses for me and my grandchildren at home. Over the course of 3 weeks, I grew close to Lula. I learned that her 3 children were living with relatives in southern Mexico. Her husband had died of some illness, and going north as a domestic worker was the only way to support them that didn't involve anything illegal. She didn't want to be a drug mule or sell her body. With an MP3 recording playing through better-sounding computer speakers, Lula could hear old Mr. Harrison snoring as she chatted quietly with me after cleaning the Westerfield's apartment. Among other things, I found out that the house had no burglar alarm and most likely no interior cameras. Most likely wasn't good enough, but it was a question I immediately continued to look for answers to. In week 4, I asked in my thick Irish if she would go to the corner drugstore to get old Mr. Harrison some underpants, since he was just out of them. When Lula found out that she would have to pay a $20 tip for this, she immediately left. I had previously covered Lula's purse with a couch cushion, and she left it behind. Pulling out my camera, I took a series of pictures of the Westerfield key with all sorts of measurements. Then I made 2 wax casts of it. I also copied all of her papers. I think the documents were borrowed, as they really didn't fit her very well. I know of several cases where 2 illegals have worked under the same legal ID. People do what they have to do to survive. If I had a family to feed, I'd do a lot worse. 15 minutes later, Lula returned with diapers. Now given an extra $20, she left, humming a religious tune I remembered from attending Mass in Spanish when I was in high school. Key blanks were common to all condominiums, and I had already bought 6 blanks. I first tried to make a copy of my own key. It was more difficult than I expected, and I learned a lot. Through trial and error and several different metal files, 2 donated blanks helped me finally produce a working key for my apartment. I tried to make a Westerfield key, but my first attempt failed. The following week, another emergency happened. While Lula was away, I was able to compare my key variations to the original. It took a few more minor adjustments, and the key to his door worked. I was able to unlock the door but didn't get in. Then I immediately relocked it. Now I was worried about whether his apartment was bugged. Lula was happy again, getting an extra $20 for 15 minutes of work. 2 days after my key worked, Joan Simmons passed away in her sleep. I was sorry to see her go, but it closed a door I had been worried about. I knew from my research that I needed special equipment to scan the apartment for electronics. A recording made surreptitiously in his apartment could be deadly. If I got the scanner, I'd have to use it, posing as a maid. I've spent the last few weeks looking for this equipment to check for bugs and cameras. I met a few computer geeks I know at a bar, and the subject of scanning somehow came up on its own. The best story I came up with was that I was afraid I was going to be bugged when I was chatting with one guy. Then my friend Jerry told me he had such a camera. Giving him his best sad puppy dog eyes, he agreed to lend it to me and show me how to use it. All it cost me was to be his eye candy at a Saturday wedding in Des Moines, Iowa, 2 weeks later. Jerry was playing for the other team and wasn't ready to socialize with his extended family. He told me that because of politics, religious bigotry, and the bigotry of several members of his extended family, it just wasn't worth it to talk openly about who he was. His partner Rico was a second-generation native of the Philippines and was very reluctant to go. Jerry's birth family knew who he was and were fine with it. In fact, it was a fun 2 days at the wedding. Jerry's extended family seemed enthralled by our performance. His mother thanked me. She was truly a soulful woman who loved her son. After receiving the scanner from Jerry after the wedding, I practiced with it in several places where I knew there were exposed, not so hidden, and very hidden electronics. It wasn't until I felt comfortable that I began scanning the hallways and stairways in the condominium building for 2 days. When all these places appeared to be clean, I decided to break into the Westerfield condo 90 minutes before Lula arrived. I was dressed as Lula and covered the scanner head with a dust mop while scanning. When the scanner came back negative, I photographed every inch of the apartment for 25 minutes. I quietly returned to my bedroom to review the investigation plans for the Westerfield apartment. Behind the locked door, Westerfield was defenseless and I had the key. Stupid is level 4 out of 10. Hearing Aunt Sophie putting the plates in the sink brought me back to the present. Dinner was over, and I told her I would go with her to the bank to put most of the cash in the safe on Tuesday afternoon. The money from the sale of the SUV would go into her checking account. The $30,000 from the sale of the vehicle should be transparent. Secati? Jail, Ron Westerfield. It's been a week, but even with the bicyclist's video, no one believed or was interested in my story. The tablet seized from me had copies of my work records and emails for 3 sales transactions. All of this information was also on a disk I had never seen, which was found hidden in my desk. These were records that I deleted and repeatedly erased from the disks 3 times. My tablet never went online. The messenger company does not exist. The facial recognition photos of that bearded 55-year-old man show 2 dead orphaned brothers, 5'10" and 5'10". Both were special forces and both died in the Vietnam War in the early 60s. My lawyer told me they are discussing a plea bargain if I turn in my handler for 3 ransoms. If I'm lucky, he's now living perfectly well in some second-world country. And he probably has a new name and possibly a new face. He's trying to bail me out, but I'm listed as a flight risk. Hey Liz, are you going to drink that beer until the end of time? Hey, who assigned you to be a beer-sipping cop, Mark? Can't a woman just sit here? I smiled as he scooted closer to me, still smiling. Maybe I'll start charging rent for that bar stool. What do you say? What a smartass he was. You know, this is the second time you've been here this week. Still celebrating? Yeah. And thanks for not getting me the blonde from PND. I was gonna hurt you if she showed up. Smiling, I reached up to tickle his side. He must have jumped a foot in the air and then tried to crawl away from my hand. Whoa, partner, fingers are fighting. In this town, you have to check your fingers with the marshal. If you don't have one, at least keep them on your side of the bar, ma'am. A smile appeared on his face. I felt it on mine, too. I'd missed flirting for the past 2 years. The bar was sparsely populated, and we sat for the next hour. Over the next few weeks between my audition and waitressing jobs, we started to get into a routine. These small acting jobs gave me a cover to have more frequent stout drinks with Mark. One day we were talking when a rowdy group of people burst into the bar. I retreated to a far booth to give Mark the space he needed to work. I remember the first time I walked into Westerfield's apartment. I was dressed as his maid Lula and ran my dust wand scanner over every inch of the apartment, all 1,200 square feet of space. After making sure there were no tracking electronics, I pulled out my very good digital camera to systematically record how he maintained the apartment as well as look for clues. Had the dust line been disturbed? Did anything look like it had recently been moved? Did dirt, sun fading, or paint shadows make sense wherever they were located? The apartment had last been cleaned a week ago, and if anything was broken, I wanted to know about it now. After Lula left having finished cleaning, I went back to the Westerfield apartment and retook all the photos. I needed a before and after view. The notes might come in handy in the future. I thank God for my 2 large monitors. I was able to view the before and after photos side by side. I remember it took me 2 days to go through the photos of his apartment and see what could be accomplished with my 2 camouflage little cameras. At first, they were hidden in a bookshelf and in the top of his entertainment center that covered his desk and countertop. It took a few days to realize that I needed more wireless microphones and cameras in the apartment. The next trip to the swap meet went well. The first thing I discovered was that Westerfield had no morals. He probably spent his spare time ripping off widows and orphans for fun and practice. The second was that he was not technically savvy, but very savvy in bureaucratic politics. The third was that he kept all of his account information, including usernames, passwords, and URLs, on little stickers taped to the back of the center desk drawer. Open the drawer and the keys to his kingdom are in front of me. The password to his desktop was my computer, and the password to his tablet was my tablet. After watching the videos of him accessing his accounts, I realized that he hadn't even tried to use any code. What he wrote was the real deal. Fool is a level 8 out of 10. Over the next few weeks, I saved active videos and sound recordings on my large hard drives with backups to a cloud account. This account was registered to an 80-year-old man in hospice care with late-stage dementia. I thanked my auntie again for her help. Since Westerfield never turned off his computer, I set it up so that all file changes were sent to the cloud account when he was supposed to be at work. I could have installed a keyboard logger on his computers, but I didn't want to disrupt his automatic antivirus programs. I checked his work on a daily basis. Keeping track of what he was doing became almost a full-time job. There was no time left for waitressing or looking for acting jobs. Destroying him without mistakes was my full-time job. Once a week, I had dinner with my aunt where I gave her no details of what exactly was going on, just general progress/non-progress. She accepted this and was always hopeful. She was my rock of support when I was discouraged. I always wondered if she knew how important she was to me. The more I followed Westerfield and the better I knew him, the more I was repulsed. Various scenarios of revenge and retribution began to surface. At first, I thought that all I had to do was plant something on him and my revenge would soon be complete. In the beginning, I thought of ways to frame him. As time went on, I realized that I didn't need to create anything bad that I could hang him for. He was providing me with tons of opportunities. Some of them were risky for me or didn't have the payoff that Westerfield deserved. One day I was watching one of the videos and discovered half a kilo of cocaine hidden in a flour tin in the kitchen. That's when I realized that cocaine played a big part in his destruction. White-collar financial crimes are very different from those of drug traffickers. Half a kilo of cocaine is far more than the minimum required for intent to distribute. I began sketching out a series of actions that could be part of the seizure. Cocaine was going to be part of the case. There were other areas I needed to target. Financially, he was going to be hit hard, and jail time was a must. If I could seriously undermine his professional credentials so that he couldn't work, that would be even better. All in all, it came down to the fact that everything had to be done without a trace. Uncle Ben was an amateur historian. I remember he once told me about a 19th century German military strategist, Helmut von something or something. I never could remember his name, but I knew the quote. Helmut said that no battle plan survives after contact with the enemy. Once a battle begins, all plans will or should be immediately adjusted or discarded in 5 minutes. If I targeted Westerfield in several different areas at the same time, one of them would have to latch on to success or at least be a major debilitating pain for him. It took weeks of detailed plans working out the intertwining details. The first strike was to be my one strike, which would have many variations. On the first strike, I was to disappear into the ether. There could be no second strike. I went back to the movie The Sting with Redford and Newman. I continued to form, tweak, and rework plans and then put them into my library of possibilities. Strengths, weaknesses, flaws, requirements, projected success rate, and more were worked out. What looked most promising was that he loaded his luggage with drugs and cash. Webcams showed me where Westerfield hid his cash and drugs and how often he checked his pirate booty. He also had accounts in the Cayman Islands. It seemed to me that they were better disclosed to the feds than trying to empty them. Perhaps it could have been done, but it was beyond me. Now I had to figure out how to get the police or the feds, and, very publicly, to be first on the scene. Westerfield traveled more for work. TSA was the second best choice after US or foreign customs. Weapons and bombs should have been visible on the X-ray scanner. I couldn't risk it being a local police officer. That would result in adjustments that could be extended if the wrong policeman happened to be there. Although I knew I could get a street gun, I didn't like that risk. Judging by the newspapers, I could go to gun shows in Wisconsin or Indiana with a wad of cash and become a straw buyer. This was happening more and more often, and I didn't want to get on the bad side of a possible ATF FBI operation. By poking around on the internet, I discovered that there are 3D printer programs for handguns. In addition, flea markets and 3D printer user groups offered a variety of suppliers of printers and printer cartridges. Used equipment was much more affordable than new equipment. It took me a month to print the gun. To get ammunition, I went to the gun range with my FOID, State Firearms Owner ID, and rented a gun of the same caliber as the 3D gun. I just made sure not to shoot all the rounds. I made sure that the gun I printed would not function because of a mismatched part. The gun should have just existed and been loaded. I also took another phone and downloaded instructions on how to use it as a detonator. Again, there was no explosive there, but it showed that it could be used as such. I needed to prove intent. At this time, Westfield bought a new suitcase for his travels. I bought 2 of them at 2 different stores at opposite ends of the subway. If I damaged one of them or needed another part, it had to be quickly available. Because of the expected security cameras in the stores, I was 2 different people. In the affluent western suburbs, I was a middle-aged man from the Indian subcontinent. In the affluent northern suburbs, I was an elderly grandmother with an Eastern European accent. It took over a week to create a decent false bottom in one of them. I modeled the size of the cocaine and the wads of his American dollars, British pounds, euros, and Mexican pesos he had hidden all over his house. I was able to use the actual detonator for the phone in my test setup. I had to make sure it would all fit properly in the false bottom. The download would have to wait until the plan was ready. Using his own computer, I accessed his accounts with usernames and passwords written by him without him knowing it. I did this the day he left his phone at the apartment. Isn't the Find My Phone app great? My goal was to hijack his accounts under my control. All of his login procedures required entering a PIN code sent to his phone. I replaced it with an email sent to his email accounts. Now it was being sent to my similar email accounts. I needed this to drain his tax-deferred and brokerage accounts, so he would be liable for taxes and penalties for early withdrawals. I found out that his current employer regularly bailed out some senior executives, but only those who brought in money. Their leased lawyers solved problems. Payouts were always cheaper than bad publicity or loss of revenue stream. So what if someone was getting money on the side to keep his job? If it was generating a couple million in revenue, what's $50,000 in a non-disclosure agreement in the grand scheme of things? One of my goals was to try to ruin his relationship with his current employer. Sexual harassment was part of the old boys club, but directly ripping off the company was leading to the termination of the nation. Westerfield entered expense reports himself, and the money went into the accounts he entered. I figured this could be used to embezzle funds from his employer. Googling the help files for the wire transfer module in his firm's accounts payable system, I realized it was worth the effort. I also had help from my friends in the IT department. Eventually, I told them I was applying for a temporary entry-level accounting position. The job would drive me to drunkenness. All I had to do was make it look like he was trying to steal. The theft didn't have to be successful. From what I'd learned about Westerfield, it appeared that he liked to do it and had probably gotten someone or two pregnant in college. He bragged several times to his buddies that he wasn't careful only when he was out of state and could get a girl drunk or drugged. During my several visits to his apartment, I swapped out his used water glasses for clean ones. I hoped to collect enough of his saliva to analyze. After that, I began to monitor his bathroom hygiene more. He was prone to messes, and a few times when he spit up, it missed the bowl of the sink and ended up on the countertop. Being cautious, I used a small amount of bottled water and a sterile razor blade on the sink to possibly collect enough DNA for a saliva sample for postal DNA testing. The condominium mailroom had a mailbox for each apartment. It was located in a side room off the main lobby. This arrangement was common in the 1920s. Bulky letters and other parcels were placed on the floor near the mailboxes. Ordering items for Westerfield using his own credit card or PayPal account and picking them up before he got home was not difficult. I ordered DNA kits from two different commercial firms offering Learn Your Family History services that I had seen on TV. If only one worked, it would guarantee that his DNA would be made public. My friend Lily found out that she has a half-sister who is 6 months older than her. Her father had already died 5 years ago, so she never got the story. I planned to mail the DNA samples on D-Day, whenever that day came. I knew it would take a few weeks for these firms to process, and I still wasn't sure if it would even get done. If it did, Westerfield might find he had a few more mouths to feed, or perhaps a statutory rape charge was in his future. My plans were as ready as they could ever be, and I spent time revising, tweaking, playing what if, and figuring out everything I came up with. I also practiced dry runs for each roll. Everything I had to do I performed several times, each time checking for improvements before deciding which method I would use. The decision was made when I found out a week in advance that he was going to fly to Seattle in 6 days, next Thursday. He was going to fly out of Midway Airport. It was now or never, but D-Day came on Thursday. On Monday, I figured out where I could be to give Westerfield his package at Midway Airport. Wherever I was, I needed a quick exit and the opportunity for a quick change of clothes. The best place was in front of the bridge by the transit station, but it never ran on the Orange Line from downtown. The worst place to run him down was at the boarding gate. Fortunately, I was able to overhear him complaining about congestion at the gate, so he preferred to use the bridge from the parking lot. The Find My Phone app and a spare luggage tag should have helped me. I practiced for 2 hours until I was sure that whichever way he chose, I had an escape plan. This was the most dangerous part of the operation. I borrowed a car to quickly leave the airport. Leaving the place where I would give Westerfield his clipboard, I would go into a frequently used restroom, change all my clothes, and stuff them into a gym bag that I folded into my clothes. I'd change wigs, change clothes, and makeup within 3 minutes. I went from an obese bike messenger to a skinny college student. Few people keep track of who goes into a stall in the men's restroom and who comes out. On D-Day, the other car would have different temporary license plates, as jewelry store robbers do all over the country. The Tuesday before D-Day, I loaded his new fake-bottom suitcase with a gun, ammo, cash, and a phone connected to his cocaine encased in an aluminum foil cube. The phone was charged, the sound was completely off, and the vibration was disabled. These instructions came with the wiring diagrams. The fake bottom of the suitcase was sealed. I replaced his real money at the condo with stacks of similar computer-printed bills. Only the top and bottom were real money. I used up several boxes of toner to make them look real. None of the inside bills would fool a hungover, underage McDonald's cashier on a Sunday morning. I counted on his usual attentiveness and carelessness. He rarely looked into what he hid in the apartment, but I had to be sure there was something there in case he did. The wires to the phone were just an add-on to create some excitement at the TSA screening. For the plan to work, there was no way he was going to get past the screeners. On the Wednesday before D-Day, Westerfield entered a slew of fake accounts into his firm's accounts payable system. This batch was to be processed on Friday while he was in Seattle. The payments were routed to accounts he controlled. Using Westerfield's login to log into his company's computer system secured his fingerprints on the theft. On Wednesday, he was in the habit of spending the evening with the wife of one of his coworkers. I figured she had a lot more to lose by testifying in his favor. Also on Wednesday, I transferred his money from tax-deferred accounts to a taxable bank account, which resulted in penalties and tax liabilities. The transaction dates would have occurred on Thursday. I also cashed in his appreciated stock. This allowed me to realize gains on his short-term shares. Short-term gains are taxed at the highest tax rate. I did all of this using Westerfield's own computers. This allowed everything to be tracked and there was no denial. I scheduled emails for mid-morning Thursday to be sent to the TSA and SEC hotlines. The financial evidence was sent to the local district attorney, as well as the DHS, FBI, and SEC. I included in the email Westfield's travel schedule, which showed him traveling to Mexico and then to Africa. That he was scheduled to leave the country on Friday was emphasized. The information was sent from a poorly secured server located in the Chicago area. The access address was copied from a drunken programming student at a party. The IRS is so understaffed that their phone line will not yield any results for months. Earth to Liz, Earth to Liz. A nudge on my shoulder brought me to my senses again. I looked up and smiled. The next half hour with Mark was warm and relaxing. I was really starting to get to know him as a person, not just a bar owner. Watching him work, I could tell when he was being friendly with the customers. He was much friendlier with me. We exchanged phone numbers and emails in the evening. After one of the many auditions, I sat in my kitchen drinking tea and relaxing. It had been a few weeks since I had discovered Westerfield. That last day was hectic. For a few days, I tracked him on the Find My Phone app on his own phone. Another tracking device was a burner phone in his luggage. I deactivated his phone after he arrived at the office. That's when I canceled his service. After he left for work, I went back to his apartment, removed the fake wads of bills, cameras, bugs, and anything else I planted. The next person I needed to take care of was Lula. Changing into rough Hispanic clothes, I waited for her at the elevator. She always arrived at 9 a.m. I warned her to come home and be with her children. Her package of 50,000 pesos and $120,000 in dollars guaranteed her immediate return home. She knew that her silence was more than appreciated. She also knew she had been given a gift. Like Cara, the Irish associate had talked in our previous conversations about people who were interfering with the cartels, and now she probably thought she had just met one of them. I'm sure her life will be much better now. She and her husband wanted to buy a store in her hometown. Now she will be able to have free money and have a good life with her children. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I realized that Westerfield was not leaving security at the airport. By 6 p.m., an elderly woman with a truck and helpers had unloaded the contents of the rented apartment and moved Otoy, old Mr. Harrison, out. The elderly woman who supervised the move informed neighbors that old Mr. Harrison had suffered a series of mini-strokes, TIAs, last week, had been stabilized, and was now being transported back to Florida to another niece. A cleaning crew of 5 people deep-cleaned the room in 2 hours. All traces of the last 5 months were removed. Keys were left in an envelope at the condo management office. The furniture was dropped off at a charity organization's unsupervised loading dock after 9 p.m. This was 50 miles away, in a working-class suburb. In this case, the original license plates of the rental truck had been replaced and the identification marks painted on the truck were discovered before the truck was returned. It was already 3 in the morning on Friday when I was finally able to return to my apartment. All of my camouflage suits had been soaked in frying oil, and thrown into several full dumpsters on the way home all over the city and suburbs. All of my computers have been dismembered and the parts thrown into several different apartment dumpsters and trash cans all over the city and suburbs. I became a true master at completely destroying electronic records and their traces. Disposal locations were determined by when the garbage company was scheduled to pick up the trash. It was time to rest, but I had to stay informed. Yet, what do you mean by saying I have to give you a DNA sample? Mr. Westerfield, this warrant states that you must provide a DNA sample. Please cooperate. 5 months after D-Day, I was sitting with Aunt Sophie eating Uno's deep dish takeout pizza. We were celebrating again. It turned out that Ron Westerfield wasn't fast enough to turn over the evidence to the states. The first person to immediately cut a deal was a low-level IT employee who was constantly overworked, underpaid, and verbally abused by the buyout firm's managers. He was constantly having his budget cut to ensure a profit margin. You don't want to mess with ordinary people. The IT guy had excellent documentation with an independently verified chain of custody of the firm's working papers. The young prosecutors didn't have to work hard to prepare the case for trial. Half a dozen co-conspirators from the firm were arrested and charged, as well as insiders like Westerfield. Due to their ability to leave the country, their passports were surrendered on bail. Prosecutors didn't have to make any deals to get more evidence. Deals were made only to reduce the amount of time needed for a conviction. It was a young prosecutor's dream case. The local newspapers reprinted it for days. It was nice to read about it in the papers. All of Westerfield's visible financial accounts were seized, as were his overseas accounts, which were documented in his clipboard. He couldn't prove where the money was coming from, and the feds thought it was drugs or money laundering. It appears he was doing both as well as some serious tax fraud. Of the $1 million+ in foreign currency that Westerfield believed was stored in his apartment, $450,000 was unaccounted for in police searches. His maid disappeared immediately after his arrest, presumably returning to Venezuela. At one of his hearings, Westerfield was taken into custody and charged with rape dating back to college. His DNA sample, obtained from now publicly available databases, matched a sample taken from a drug-addicted college student who was raped. A warrant for his DNA sample was obtained in connection with the current rape charge. Bail was set at $500,000, which he had difficulty raising. His previous funds had been frozen by several judges. Fortunately, his apartment was still an unappropriated property. My aunt and I still kept a low profile, but our relationship with Mark was beginning to heat up. 2 months after D-Day, he asked me to help him on a stakeout. We needed to follow a possibly runaway husband to a nice restaurant. Mark asked if we could enjoy a meal while he was working. What, I'm turning down a nice dinner with him while we play spies? I dressed to the hilt, and it was wonderful. We were seated close enough to see everything but not hear them talking. Mark wanted to take a picture of his husband's wandering hands on the inside of his companion's thigh, but couldn't figure out how to do it without attracting unwanted attention. For me, it was like falling off a log. Looking around, I asked him in a whisper if he had a personal cell phone with internet access. After receiving an affirmative answer, I read him the law about posting his own information. His information would be imprinted in the photos. I pulled out my newest camera phone, not as good as his, and told him to use that. He perplexedly agreed and waited. After making a little noise, I said, "Oh yes, you have to take my picture. I want to remember this moment forever," and fluttered my eyelashes in his direction. Kind of vulgar, but it made our actions look normal. Then I started posing. Mark immediately realized this, pulled out my phone and started with a few single shots, and then switched to video mode where he focused on his target and girlfriend. He then switched to video mode, showing the entire scene, and finally focused on his hand caressing her thong. I found out later that they were so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice that his hands between her legs were quite visible under her short skirt. After dinner, we looked at the pictures and discussed what was good, what was bad, and what could have been better. This turned out to be the first of many observations. Unfortunately, good spies have to blend into the background. There were no more fancy dinners, but we started celebrating at home after work. 2 years later, my aunt and I were eating takeout pizza at my apartment when she smiled and stood up. "Let's drink to that asshole. since he's now broken actually doing time. I clinked my glass of Aunt Sophie's wine when she said, Che peccato. That means, what a pity. We giggled, and then the doorbell rang. As if on cue, Mark appeared and I invited him in. He kissed Auntie on the cheek and then me in a long, sensual kiss. After all, our partnership as an investigative LLC corporation was going well. Our marriage was hot too. I'd been lucky. Luck takes a lot of hard work.